And then hi, Windsor again, and Tucson, good to see. And then I'm going to screen share on this desktop. Seem to be learning my ways around, and then start the actual presentation. Okay, can somebody confirm on the chat that they can see the presentation? Perfect, thanks, Ken, great. Okay, so I got hands raised, I got everything else. All right, we just broke 100, so I think that's a good time to start. All right, so a couple things first. So the presentation itself will last about 45 minutes, which will leave anywhere between 15 to 30 minutes at the end. I know I said it was an hour long. People feel free to drop. This is being recorded, so if you got to drop, need to go do something else. Some of you East Coasters, you know, maybe getting sleepy. 9:30 is past my bedtime, so when you get into that time, but feel free. And then as we're going through, I won't stop and answer questions as we're going, but feel free to ask them. If we put them in the chat, they sometimes get lost. So put them into the Q&A. If you notice at the bottom, if we're doing just regular meetings, it doesn't have the Q&A, but for the webinars, they have a Q&A box. So you can type in under Q&A, and then it'll save them there, and then I can go through those at the end, and I'll take plenty of time at the end. So you'll get the presentation. You also get some of the materials that are referenced in here. There's a couple of charts and graphs that people tend to find pretty interesting as well. That being said, we are, I believe, at almost 5, right on the money, 5 after, which is when I like to start these. So I want to thank you all for joining tonight, and I want to welcome you to the Psychology of Photography. I created the Psychology of Photography as a way to understand my own and also to help other people on parts of their creative path. So the Psychology of Photography, and this is my brand new logo. Yes, yeah. I didn't design it myself. I have no artistic drawing skills. My artistic skills are limited to my photography skills. But it really consists of 3 main elements, and we'll talk about different parts. The brain, and how we combine our brain and how we think and observe the world around us. And with the other part really kind of coming into the ideas portion, where we get our ideas, where we draw our inspirations, etc. And then bringing them all together, kind of tying all 3 of them together in a really cohesive way is how and where we immerse ourselves into this natural environment. So it's in these places, and when we get all 3 of these kind of operating really well, we can get the most inspiration in our subject matter of choice, whatever that is. So that's the basis of it. What is the most important element in creativity, though? And I would tell you right off the bat, the most important element in creativity, or even in photography, is you. Is the person that is interested in pursuing more than just superficial in your creative work. That makes the creative process so special. You're beyond, most of you are beyond or have desires to go beyond just taking simple snaps and understanding more about the creative process, your photographic journey, and how you work through that. So the Psychology of Photography is here to help you think about your work and yourself in different ways that have been traditionally taught or sometimes have been learned. It is my belief that photography is one of the greatest outlets we have to express emotions, tell stories, share our world with others, and in turn, we get the gift and the opportunity to learn about ourselves. So this is where we come up with a new type of photographer, the psychographer, combining the brain and thought process of psychology, so going back to the earlier portion of the brain portion, and the technical and creative ways of the photographer as the ways to capture this world. So one is not reliant completely on technical, and nor is the other one reliant completely on the brain and just remaining completely in an artistic state. It's about merging the 2 of them together into a much more creative and cohesive way. So what is some of the analogy of a psychographer? Well, in many ways, psychographers, we look to develop some elements of the following. Some of the eyes of the brain for spotting opportunities, what's out there within the scenes and the situations we're encountering. The stomach, A, for trusting our gut and staying true to what we want to represent in our work, etc. But B is also kind of, I guess not even the stomach, is that thick skin to cope with the lows. The creative process can be lonely at times. The creative process is hard. It's messy. It isn't always, we don't just go from one bright spot to another bright spot to another bright spot within our photography. We oftentimes will have these ups and downs where we don't understand a technique, we don't understand a method, we don't understand how to go about it and get a particular image that we want. So a thicker skin to cope with these eventual lows, and also to not get too inflated with the highs. The next part of it is the brain full of ideas. So having these ideas about projects we want to do, ways we want to express ourselves, what these images are saying as we work and continue to work with our work in other areas. And then the heart full of passion. You won't remain a photographer for very long without a passion to create, or a passion, and or ideally both, a passion to see the world a little bit differently. So the photographers I've taught over the years that I see kind of come and go, some of which that leave, others that stay really one. A lot of them really have that passion. Maybe they're not the best photographers. They don't put a lot of tremendous amount of time and effort into it, but they have such passion for creation and seeing the world differently. They have the right mindset about what it means to them to create, versus people that come in with extremely high expectations about perfection, about other parts and pieces of this journey. They're the ones I see burn out and typically don't continue on down on the process. And so this comes into patience. And then the final part is the feet. And that's the feet to actually get out there and photograph. A, and B, when we're in the field, which I'll talk about when we talk about composition, to move ourselves around and not lock into tripod lock, where we stay in one place and we don't move our cameras or our mindsets at all. So kind of moving through that. So I want you to consider what this means to you as the photographer. The camera looks both ways. Because the reality is your images are as much a documentation and interpretation of yourself as they are of the subject matter that we choose. And what we choose to capture drives our creative process, and in turn, that creative process can drive us or ourselves. It's oftentimes as we look through our lenses that we discover a new way to view the world, but more often than we also discover a new way to view ourselves. So what does psychology mean? One of the varied and many definitions out there is the study of the human mind and its functions, especially those affecting behavior in a given context. So I want us to unpack this a little bit more before we kind of move on. The key lies with our minds buried deep within that amazing thing we call a brain. As we look at our behaviors, we look at the conscious and subconscious functions that affect our actions in different contexts. All too often, we focus on the formations of what our conscious mind thinks or sees and how we describe that. I'll say that again. All too often, we focus on what our conscious mind thinks or sees and how we describe something. So pretty, dark, or bright, for example. So we'll focus more on what we think we see, versus what our subconscious actually feels emotionally. And when I'm talking about that, when I'm talking about what we feel emotionally in images, and we've all had them either in our own work or the work we've seen, when we're feeling something. We're not feeling pretty, we're not feeling dark, we're not feeling bright, we're feeling some deeper emotions. We might be feeling scared or happy or excited or sad. And so most importantly, at least for tonight, is to think about how these thought patterns are formed. They're often formed without us knowing and have more of an impact on our images than almost anything else we do as photographers. I'll say it one more in a different way. What we see subconsciously registers in our brains and impacts how we feel more than the actual elements we see. So an image like this is not about water and waves, rock and sun. It becomes about power and force and awe, and maybe even a little bit of that wonder. So another way to think about this, conscious versus unconscious, is the old analogy of the iceberg, where 90% of what you see is below the surface. People sometimes talk about this as left brain hemisphere or right brain work. So we live about 10% of our time on this planet in the conscious part of our brain. In photography, these are our thoughts, our perceptions, our decision-making, what we're going to do, how we're going to photograph a scene, etc. So thinking of this iceberg and what lies beneath gives our work the emotional depth that we seek in the creative process. These are where we get into our emotions, where we get into creativity, ideas, imagination, but also where we get into fears and emotion. This is where oftentimes the real work can get done. It's not only what we feel emotionally, but when other people feel when they look at our work. Probably one of the best examples I have of this is from a non-photographer. Her name is Elizabeth Gilbert. Many of you would know her for the movie Eat, Pray, Love with Julia Roberts. She also writes a tremendous book about creativity. And she gives a story in that where she says she's at a book signing and this woman comes up to her and says, I am just so inspired that you had the strength to leave that abusive husband and get away from that bad situation in that scene and blah, blah, blah. And Elizabeth says, the story was really interesting. I really appreciated that woman telling me this, but none of that was in my book, was in the movie, or was any part of my life and what I've done. And what that means for us as photographers is also, it's about what we feel, but it's also about what other people project onto our images and how they see the images. So just 5 things make up the psychology of photography and your journey as the psychographer. The first of which is the foundation of where most of us start, sensations and perceptions, is how we see the world and make order out of it. I call this part discovery, where we start to make order in our images and see how we fit into this. This is where we might learn valuable lessons like humility or awe, and we start to discover some of that wonder of the process or the world in the stage. The second is beliefs and creativities. What do we believe in and how do we choose to create? Yes, those are 2 separate things. What we believe in and how we create are 2 separate entities. This is where we learn what kind of scenes we like. We discover how we like to create, and we begin to establish much deeper beliefs about the creative process. The next is expression and interpretation. How do we interpret scenes and develop them and oftentimes ourselves through processing? So this is where we start to dig into what we might be feeling emotionally while photographing, but also physically processing our images to get a vision or a feeling to align. And that's the key theme I'm going to talk about, is alignment. We want emotional congruence. We want congruency, not emotional. We want congruency in our images. We want things to align. So this part is about development. The fourth foundation is formation and evolution. This is where we begin to explore the kind of photographer we are, or we want to be, and where we are going. The introspective side. We begin to explore. We try 2 new techniques. We learn new skills. And we start to form some elements of our own style. And the final step of the 5 steps is ultimately one we need to revisit time and time and time again on our way in this journey, and that is reflection and refinement. This is where we put ourselves and our processes into a constant state of renewal, where we get into the zone or flow and things can start to become more automatic. We no longer stress about the technical, and we're able to focus on revisiting parts and pieces of early steps. These stages can run concurrently, and chances are you will need to revisit earlier stages as you move through this process. So how did I get here? What steps did I take or not take to be able to end up with you here tonight? I'd like to introduce you, I'm going to take a drink, to the shadow of mixed over past. You could say I was a page skipper in the book of life. I hold an MBA, not a psychology degree, and I've been called by many a serial entrepreneur. My motto for most of my non-photography professional career was, and I'm not kidding, relentless sense of urgency. At this time this picture was taken, I was deep into massive career burnout and struggling to put the pieces of my life back together after that workaholism and relentless sense of urgency had run rampant for years. One thing was clear to me: I needed to find the answers, and it was not going to be doing more of what I was already doing. So I stepped down. I walked away from the CEO role, the ego binds of my MBA, the bickering partners, the ungrateful employees, and all the chaos. And I turned to where I wanted to be and where me, like most of you, find solace, and that's nature. I've always found myself wanting to be outside and in nature, climbing mountains, riding bikes, hiking, or trail running. I never stopped to consider that all this time in nature had another opportunity, that opportunity to create. As I started on my journey as a photographer, I didn't think of myself as a creative. I didn't think of myself as an artist or someone that anything that could ever be said through my work. I just wanted to take pictures, travel, spend time in nature, and explore. But as I worked to rebuild my life and began to understand what made me, well, me, I also saw psychological aspects of my images and how I felt during doing certain types of creative work. The more I understood about myself, the more I understood about my work. And the more I understood about my work, well, the more I understood about myself. What happened is I started to get into a self-reinforcing, self-perpetuating cycle of growth. It was with my creative side and my own growth, these two, my creative side and my personal growth working together, that helped me bring about a certain level of emotional depth in myself and eventually, or as I should say, in my images. But here's where I initially got it wrong. My order was all messed up. You see, what I was trying to do was to get that final stage of renewal without putting any time into the building blocks of these other variables. All I wanted to do was explore. But in order to explore, I needed to understand more about so much more. How did I really perceive the world? What did I believe in as a creative? And how could I even go about developing a scene or understand what I was dealing with or working with within the environment? What I quickly found as I mastered much of the technical was the way to become a better photographer was not in mastering the latest camera model, perfecting a processing method, or traveling the world to the hottest photography locations. The best way for me to become a better photographer was to become a more interesting person. This was about going through the craft, using the craft of photography to get to the person that I was below. So where did I look to get all of these answers? How did I initially look to define my creative process? Yes, Instagram. My intentions were not all wrong on this, what I would consider destroyer of creativity. I just took the wrong approach to how and where I reach people with my work. As I poured time, money, and effort into growing my Instagram, I discovered I was not finding my value, unearthing my voice, or producing any type of meaningful work. What I was doing was not what I wanted to do, rather what I thought I was supposed to be doing, or in the worst case, just what others liked, but what didn't resonate with me. I became obsessed over the number of reposts, my comparison to others, how well are my photos doing, the lack of shares, lost followers, gained followers, how many likes were my images getting. The list goes on, lack of comments. But at the end, I had to ask 3 questions. Who was I creating for? Why was I creating? And what was I creating? So the problem was not laziness or empathy or apathy or not being willing. The problem was running my creative process like a business problem, a variable that needed to be solved. I somehow thought this formula would work. Sunset plus beach plus ocean plus lighthouse plus elephant seals is bound to equal great image. If they get all of these things in an image, it's bound to be an amazing capture, except it was not true. The formula does not add up for this image. And for a long time in my work, it was simply not adding up for me. So just after I hit 10,000 followers, an arbitrary and meaningless goal of mine, it was even worse than ever. I was not connected to my work, to my followers, or to any sort of a creative process. So I pulled the plug. I got completely off of social media. So while I quit and committed some type of social media suicide, I honestly took a step back from photography for a while as a whole. It was in the strength of walking away that I started to really better understand myself. I had to ask lots of hard questions without knowing that something like this was within me. Like, where was the greatest opportunity within my work? Where was I weakest? What was I missing? Where did I really want to go with my work, and what did I want my work to represent? It was only as I began to quiet my life without the distractions of producing for someone else that I started to think about how certain images activated my brain and my mind in different ways than others. I couldn't even describe early on what made a scene compelling or why I was reaching into my camera bag for something, but I knew enough to see it in the field sometimes. What made one image more compelling than the other? What kind of scenes did I enjoy photographing the most? It was in this time that I was able to ask and to listen for the answers versus moving on to the next set of questions. How was I reacting to what I was experiencing in the field? What was I drawn to on my creative journey? Was I able to think of myself as an artist? This is where I really started to take the first steps in the journey of the psychographer. This is where we deal with the first major principle. How do we perceive the world and make order out of it? I knew I've always had that sacred space in nature. I also believed I could find myself in that place time and time again. I just needed to tune into this and listen. Really listen. So it's impossible to give you a quick summary of psychology or give useful definition, a one-size-fits-all definition of psychology. Some areas of psychology are very technical and require specialist knowledge of statistics or cutting-edge computer programming, while other areas of psychology require the cultivation of listening skills and reflection. Wait a second. Listening skills. Isn't that just another form of observation? Observing what is going on within me and within the natural environment around me? Ask most people what they see in this image and they might reply, sunset, water, seaweed, or rocks. But is that how we connect with our images? People don't connect with water or rocks. They do connect with textures and feelings. They connect with how being around water makes them feel. They also feel something more with colors. This brings some of the emotion in and puts some order into our scenes. Images that connect with people are also about the visual flow within an image. It's about using the elements you are presented within the field in a cohesive way, that cohesive principle. How to use everything together in a manner to guide the viewer through your image in a pleasing manner and encourage them to stay and explore your image longer. This is where we begin to make order of our images, understanding these interrelationships between lines and shapes, colors and textures. Each one of them can make us feel something different. This is also where we can get connected not only to our images, but to our creative process. As we get more connected to our images and the experiences, we start to form connections to these elements and understand more about how they can work together to produce certain feelings and emotions. So another way to think about our connection to the scene is how have we been conditioned to respond to the scene? So most of us are familiar with the concept of Pavlov's dog. Ivan Pavlov worked over time to prove in various ways that you can actually train living creatures. In his case, mostly dogs could be conditioned to respond a certain way. So how does this apply to us as photographers? Well, even before we were conditioned as photographers, we probably reacted like a salivating dog as a human just to seeing a beautiful sunset. So then maybe we picked up a camera and tried to take some images, but without that unconditioned stimulus of a sunset, and with a camera in our hands, many of us didn't know how to respond at all. We didn't get that unconditioned response of salvation. We simply hadn't conditioned ourselves to see the beauty beyond the obvious. But what happens next, or happens for most of us, especially those that choose nature or wildlife or landscape photography, is we started to condition ourselves to the point when we had that camera in our hands, plus that golden light or that unconditioned stimulus, we started to pair the two together and get that unconditioned response of salvation. Salivation, I can't say salivation correct today, sorry. But here's the interesting thing. Through this conditioning of ourselves, we started to get a similar response anytime there was a camera in our hands. This is where the real opportunities lie. These are the countless other ways to condition ourselves to be open to more than just good light and ideal conditions. The second part of the psychographer journey is where we start to begin to move forward. We start to see the possibilities in areas of our work we never considered before. We begin to form thoughts about how we create, what we believe in, and where we find the most interest in our work. The challenge is to allow ourselves some confidence, but not too much, that is also shown in another psychology concept called the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is a cognitive bias in which most people with low ability at a task overestimate their ability. While some people could say this is the disease of the arrogant, it's a more reflective of the cycle many of us will or have experienced as photographers. At the top of Mount Stupid, yes, up here, you've just mastered some new concept, gotten a great capture, or figured out some new project, but you don't oftentimes last long till you plunge into the valley of despair. I can tell you this is where I see people give up on photography. They lose hope and they start to look for shortcuts. What we need to avoid is not the valley of despair altogether, but it's having that belief that we can get out and begin that slow climb up towards the slope of enlightenment and over time to the plateau of sustainability. What happens here is things start to make sense. We go through this multiple times on our creative journey. Knowing it's coming is the key, but having the patience and perspective is how we can grow as creatives. So the 4 ways we can communicate without words in our images. 1, composition. Where and how are we directed within a scene? Lines and shapes. How do we make order out of the world that's in front of us? Color. How do certain colors help us feel or discover? How are these complementary to our compositions and our lines and our shape? And then the final one is light. 4 ways, the 4 biggest ways we can communicate in the field, in our images, and the 4th one is light, and this is about creating transitions, tone, depth, showcasing things that showcase our composition, our lines, and our colors in a cohesive way. So we all how we choose to develop, if we do it correctly, should be like the famous Rorschach tests. We all see the world a little bit differently. Seeing things differently was what makes us the great creatives we are, or that we're growing into becoming. Sometimes the scene leaves little interpretation, while other times we get the unique opportunity to present that to the world through our own lens. I consider this how we interpret scenes, or composition. Some photographers rely too much on compositional elements. The checklist is often very brief with little thought for why they are doing something. The cliche of learn the rules and then break them comes up a little short. I say understand the rules and then learn to play with them. It's one thing to know a rule and a completely different thing to know why that rule has emotional impact. I'm not going to have the time tonight to show you 19 of these examples in 19 images, but I do have tutorials on the subject. I am going to show you 7 of these rules in one image, because just like we need to focus stack sometimes on our images, I challenge you also to consider composition stacking for more impact. So this remains a very popular image for me. Whenever it's seen, it usually comes with some type of a comment. The photographers want to comment on the technical mastery of getting the exposure just right and wanted to say how lucky I was. The non-professional photographers want to talk more about their desire to simply see a moose, while others might be as simple as, I love the Tetons, to where is that? While you could say none of these comments were right or wrong, because photography is not a contest, I have a slightly different reaction or feeling, that of movement in an image like this. So I ask you, where do you see the movement? Many of you will respond, the moose. Isn't that a trick question? You are correct. We do see it in that, but we also see movement within our images, within the lines. These compositional elements, or the triangles and diagonals that create movement. What happens in images like this is we follow those lines up and down and up and down and up and down. Working this way through the image in different formats and ways, and they may be finding different opportunities to work through the reflections. There's a certain level of tension that is created in images like this between the peaks and the trees. The trees are also triangles within the scene that creates even more movement. So that's part of the composition. The second part, let's talk about what you might feel. Some of you might feel jealousy that I captured this image, but I want you to remember photography is not a competition with others. The thing I hear often from clients, print clients of mine and photographers is that feeling of calm. Calm, not from the diagonals of the peaks or the fact that this mama moose was moving at a rather frantic pace in search of her calf. Calm because there's symmetry in this image. What symmetry does in our images is it gives our brain rest. There's nothing that the brain needs to balance. Symmetrical images should not produce tension or chaos, ideally. The most powerful images of symmetry are calming, a place where you can go for that rest. The brain doesn't have to do the hard work of balancing this image. The other thing symmetry gives is the ability for the mind to compare between two images, a little bit of a game to see the differences between the top and the bottom, all of which is eye movement, brain movement, and engagement, things that we want in our images. Ultimately, this is what you want, regardless of what you want to say, is more time in your images by the viewer. The next thing to consider is how our brain reads images. Most of us read left to right in most cultures. For those of you that are going to ask, yes, I've been told by people that read up or down or right to left, they still have a preference for this, which is interesting. And I think it's also been said that this is the way we read, but it's also the way we recall. When we're recalling a past event, we're looking up to the left typically. When we're thinking of the future, we're looking to the right. So think about that and how our brain is trained. The brain likes to follow movement that goes from left to right in your images. If you don't believe me, try this on some of your images and flip them, and you'll probably find you're going to like the movement going left to right. There's also the same thing on the need for space. The brain wants space around the objects in our images to be able to visualize the moose coming into the scene, as we can see here from the left, and then also having a place for it to move into. Also the mountains and the reflection and the trees, not making the borders feel crowded, like the mountains have a space to grow into, which is part of one of the principles, other compositional principles, called negative space. Space for the objects to move into, not just the moose. We need to be able to feel like there's movement, there's space within the images for things to move around. And before we move on from this image, is there anything else about this image that makes it maybe feel three-dimensional? The final composition or the final component of this particular image is depth. And what happens with depth is your eye will always end up with the brightest part of the image, where it will make a decision to exit and move on. So it's going to always end up, the eye will end up with the bright Tetons. It'll make a decision to exit or move on, or to stay and to linger. What layers do in our scene is allow the brain to section off and move through different layers or levels within the image. The reflection in the foreground might lead you to the reflection of the moose, which leads you to the moose itself, into the green of the grass, into the trees, into the fog, up to the mountains. And then you maybe move back through the image in some different regard or different colors, working through the blues, looking through the greens, working through the warmer tones of the image. So thinking of that depth within our images is bringing much more dimensionality into the image versus one flat color, one flat thing. The next part, which is a separate thing from composition, but the two of them go together, is what I call the emotional life of shapes and lines. And you'll get these two, I'll send you these two diagrams along with the composition one. So this is where we start to deepen our interactions with the world through the lens, and we might start to see and recognize lines in our images and their emotional impact. I'd say one of our jobs as photographer is simply to recognize and be able to capture lines. When we get the opportunity to work and discover how we use these lines, these are the things that can bring that three-dimensionality and depth that we're talking about. And so just as I've given, or it's been given to most of us, color that is, we now have to take it away. For this next section, I'm going to take away the color I'm going to show you. For the longest time, it was lunacy to me is I clung to the belief that color is really all that I had in my images. Layer on top of that a misguided belief that black and white photography was just for the harsh midday light, when the good photography light was not there, and I couldn't have been more wrong. Color is a major driver of our emotional connection to our images, but we can't rely on this color to tell a story, nor should we be overly reliant on the color when we should be focusing on composition and lines within our images. Ask any photographer, do they like taking photos of mountains? And most, or even the most sophisticated one would probably respond, well, duh. Because in real life, the mountains are dynamic, they're endless, they're multidimensional. But in a photograph, we lose that third dimension and we're left with two-dimensional lines. Things that are defined by less idealist terms like length and width. And take that color away, how does our image begin to stand? Composition, think of composition as the wires of a suspension bridge, the walls of your home, the cup in which you put your coffee. It's what holds our images together. And lines are what give our images movement. What we see in lines and images like this are masculine lines or picturesque lines, a combination of something that's dynamic, a process that's characterized by constant change, activity, and process. And I'm talking about these dynamic, these jagged, these brutal lines moving up and down within the image. And so while this image is alive in my mind, I can still feel it like I was there, it's flat on my paper. And the lines within this image, the lines within the clouds, the lines within this, they create that movement so these images don't lie flat in our minds. Look at a scene like this in color and you'll most likely either gravitate directly to that setting sun. But take away the color and you'll start to see some of the supporting structure of the image, which gives it some bones on which to stand. We've got passive line in the sand, passive lines. These are things that are accepting, they're allowing of what's to come to them. The water could drain out, people could walk on them. These are passive lines, they're not the main showstopper. Then we have positive or bold or forceful lines. These are the waves that travel a long period of time to crash forcefully on this beach. They have a vivid appearance, assertive presence. And then we have parallel lines. These are in harmony. This energy's been dispersed out of there. These are lines that are free to exist at the same time or in similar ways. Their power's been removed, but yet they're still regal. And not all the horizontal lines within our images are in the water. As we look to the horizon line of the clouds and see calmer lines, things that are not showing or projecting a feeling of any type of nervousness, anger, or other strong emotion. And then finally, we see the pier with its very direct lines extending or moving from one place to another by the shortest route possible. That which is direct, sure, it has purpose within our lines. The final thing I'll say on lines is the most common element is the vertical line. They're almost everywhere. But when was the last time you stopped and thought, hey, look at that great vertical line versus exclaiming, wow, look at that tree? Feeling inspired is one of the most impactful things we can have in our images or feel in nature. This is the invitation nature extends to us to be mentally stimulated to do or to feel something, where we can build upon the nobility of the vertical lines and the imposing or magnificent appearance. We start to also bring forth that dramatic, that exciting, that expressive. Beyond the nobility, you might also notice the lines in opposition, where we have life and death, both having vertical lines in their trunks. Sometimes vertical lines can cancel each other out, but in this case, they create a healthy conflict or competition between this life and death. Lines also encourage us to rise. This regal tree attains something even in death. But lines are not just about verticals and horizontals. They're also about how they complete their journey and form circles. Circles are not something that's prominent in nature, but they have huge emotional meaning. They bring forth immensity with their extremely large size, large scale, or extent of something. While other times they're about vastness or something we as humans don't often get to experience, eternity or infinite or unending time. But how also they can bring forth equality, a state of being equal, especially in status, rights, or opportunities. So we've worked through how we perceive scenes, established some foundations on our beliefs and how we might create. Now let's look at how we might interpret scenes. This is where we start to play with processing in our images, but also how we start to see colors and textures that bring our images to life. where we start to speak about things like warm and cool tones, where we start to describe scenes, where we see lines kind of forming and directing within our images. As we evolve as photographers, we have many, many choices to make, creative choices, choices about where to explore, the styles of photography, what we want to make images, the list goes on and on and on. The one thing we cannot control is the eye of our viewers. The eye and the brain doesn't have a choice. It will not follow where you want it to go, nor will it abide by some belief that you have of where it needs to go. It will always go to the places of the most contrast, the most brightness, the warmer parts of the image. So is it pointless and we should just surrender? The point is, the truth is, you can't control where the viewer's eyes are going to go, but you can directly or greatly influence its path. We can't tell it where to go. We can tell it where to go with color, shape, texture, and brightness. So there are 5 elements I teach about in my classes that make compelling images. That is the elements of depth or dimensionality, focus, where do we want people to look, sharpness. Not everything should be uniform sharp. That which is closest to you should be the sharpest. That which is further away should be less sharp. Textures. What do we want to feel? What do we want to touch within our images in luminosity or the brightness or those transitionary elements within our images? These are the 5 major elements of focus that really bring about compelling images. And this is the core of the 4th foundation, which is about expression and processing. So we've worked through discovery, creativity, development. Now how about exploration? I like the words of Joseph Campbell here to guide us. One way or another, we all have to find what best fosters the flowering of our humanity in this contemporary life and dedicate ourselves to that. We will revisit this stage at many times in our journey. It changes as we evolve and as our skills improve. Also, as we discover new techniques, subjects, or change our focus as part of photography. And as we explore, we're all bound to experience this as some part of our formation and evolution. We start to deal with something called Beck's cognitive triad. It might start with negative views about the world, where we might start to say or hear things in our mind like, it's all been photographed before, or there's just so many photographers out there, how could my work ever stand out? But unfortunately, it doesn't stop with views of the world. It often permeates at times into our views of the future, where the narrative starts with, I'm never going to figure this out, or maybe I started too late, or it's just too complex. And this can move into negative views out there about ourselves. There's just too much to learn. I'm just not that good at photography. Here's the thing. None of this is actually true. Chances are we've successfully faced these gremlin downs in many other parts of our lives. We're just not as aware of them in our creative work. So now let's not let them get us down, because the truth is your work's not perfect. My work's not perfect. And because of that imperfection, we ourselves are then kind of perfect. But you know what else is perfect? Not always perfect, I mean, light. The light is rarely perfect in our images, and we need this to shape our images and for all of us to evolve. From the plants to the animals and everything in between, the most important natural element we encounter in photography is light. Light is the most talked about aspect of photography with landscape photographers. I think you could even say we're obsessed with it. But how often or how many times do you think about what the light is communicating emotionally within your image? I'll go into much more depth on this on February 4th, so this week. But I want to highlight just a few examples related to color and light. For most humans, we see light the same. The wavelengths of these warmer colors, the reds, the oranges, the yellows, are just longer wavelength. That is the reason we see these first. So color theory is not just based on a theory, it's actually based on how we see light. It's also where we start to set the moods and tell a story. We all know Roy G. Biv from The Rainbow. But while this is a spectrum of color that we can see from time to time is a nice display of the variety of colors we see in nature, it is not a representation of what we see typically. This image here is actually an intentional camera movement from Pismo Beach. What this image represents is the variation in color you would see in a sunset that most of us tune out and focus on just the brightest, most colorful part of the scene. So an image like this would move from the sand to the area where the waves are lightly lapping, to the wave there, the ocean area, I guess you could call it, the not so distant horizon. Then we have the horizon, then we have the sunset, and then we have the clouds above the sunset. So the color gradation is there. We just oftentimes only focus on the brightest parts and pieces within our images. So one of the Beck's exercises that I've found to gauge and work with different types of light is to go to the same scene again and again at different times: nighttime, dusk, dawn, blue hour, golden hour, midday, etc. And by going to these places at different times of day and photographing in different light conditions, we start to see the dramatic variations in the emotional impact of these images. We see the different textures form. We see opportunities for way different compositional elements. So these become a big part. The next big part too is color. Teaching a class in 2 weeks on color. All color we see in the world comes from some combination of the three primaries: red, yellow, and blue. These then break into 3 secondary colors and then an endless number of tertiary colors. These factor not only what we feel emotionally, but how we're also conditioned to feel certain things. Part of this comes into color schemes. So as photographers, we talk about warms and cools, but that's only part of the story. It's how they relate to each other in an emotional context. There's between 5 and 7 color schemes that are widely used and accepted as having some types of design elements that will evoke certain feelings, emotions, tones, or maybe even tension within our image. Tonight I'm going to show you 2 and understanding how they work together to communicate. So complementary colors, these are things that are across from each other on the color wheel. So just as black and white are opposite, warms and cools are opposite. And what happens in warms and cools is the high contrast creates a vibrant look, but it also starts to be that tension of moving between the warmth and that feeling and the cools in the back, and what that movement back and forth within our images versus analogous color schemes. This is when we'll bring about much more calm. So we have tension, a little bit more tension between the warms and the cools, a lot more movement, versus this image, much more calm. These are harmonious. They're much more pleasing to the eye. You still need to have enough contrast with choosing analogous color schemes, but they can work really well in forest scenes or other things where you have very similar colors that you can work through. So the psychologies of color, we'll talk about these real. I caution you not to get too technical into color theory. There's so many different color theories out there, but there is 6 main colors, the primaries and the secondaries, and what they convey. So blue calls to mind feelings of calmness or serenity. This is often described as peaceful, tranquil, serene, or orderly. Stability and reliability often comes about from blue. Also can bring out for some people sadness. We most of the time see blue in skies and water, and sometimes in flowers, or oftentimes. Interestingly enough, aside from you take out the water and the skies, it's the least common color in nature. What is the opposite of calm? Well, intensity. Let me introduce red. Red is a bright, warm color that evokes much stronger emotion. It's also considered an intense color that creates feelings of excitement or intensity. In calmer tones, though, dramatic sunsets, red rock, or fall foliage, red is associated with love, warmth, and comfort. We had red and blue, intensity and calm. What does the third primary bring out in us? Yellow. It's a bright color that's often described as cheery or warm. Since yellow is considered the most visible color based on the spectrum, it is also the most attention-getting color. Yellow can be used in small amounts to draw notice, or in large amounts where it looks real and not something you see every day, like the fall colors of this cottonwood. And green is not a primary like blue. It's the combination of yellow and blue, which explains oftentimes for those of you that are photographing forest scenes, your images can sometimes feel more yellow than green, and because there's no such thing as pure green. Green is a cool color on the cool spectrum that symbolizes nature and the natural world. Perhaps because of its strong associations with nature, green is often thought to represent tranquility, good luck, and health. Purple, which is the combination of blue and red, does not occur very often in nature. For that reason, it sometimes feels exotic or artificial. And it's oftentimes a very polarizing color. People tend to either really love purple or hate it. And it also represents spirituality or wisdom. Its rare, mysterious nature causes people to kind of feel more connected to that unknown. It's also a very difficult color to discriminate. It has the strongest electromagnetic wavelength, actually just being a little bit up from X-rays, which may be part of the reason that it's called so many different names, from magenta to violet to lavender to plum. And it's oftentimes we'll see these color casts. Red and yellow form together to make orange. And while not a favorite color on most people's list, most people like the energy in orange. What it calls to mind are feelings of excitement, enthusiasm, warmth. It's also the color of bright sunsets and fruits such as oranges or tangerines. So many people associate the color with the beauty of a setting sun or the refreshing taste of citrus. So as the sunset starts to set on the main portion of the presentation, I want to talk about a couple quick opportunities, and then we'll dive into some closing thoughts and then Q&A. So I mentioned earlier, I got a couple classes coming up. These are photo bite classes. These are 45-minute classes with about 30 minutes of Q&A, $15, 100% money back guarantee. So you take one of the classes, it doesn't resonate, just tell me, I'm happy to refund your money. Don't have to do that very often, but sometimes people, it doesn't resonate or they're not sure what to try. The next two classes I'm teaching are about evaluating and working with light in photography, and then the science and emotion of color in nature photography. And then as we get going further on, we're going to go deeper dives, smaller classes, more hands-on, more interactive. So here's the evaluating working light. You'll get a little bit of information on that. The other thing I want to say is I haven't announced these on Meetup. For those of you that are newsletter subscribers, you know about this. I'm continuing the kind of psychology of photography series with free presentations in March, April, May. The next one is the power to create, followed by fear in photography. And then the fourth, I should say, of the series is going to be discovery of our creative vision. So these are really exciting presentations coming up. I hope you guys can join. These will be at the same time, 5:30 Pacific time, 8:30 Eastern. You'll get detail on these ones. Feel free to register. There'll be free classes, which is great. Final two things I'll say, and then we'll go into the last element of psychology of photography. One is the psychology of photography meetup, which is how many of you found me. Excuse me. There's a lot more to come. I'm working on the Inspired Creator Scholarship, which will be a scholarship open for people from 9 to 99. No, not to work on different creative scholarships. So that's coming, and also the Psychology of Photography podcast is in the works. So really exciting stuff there. So, all right, some closing thoughts. We'll talk about the final fifth element as well. So, final part of tonight is how do we put ourselves into our processes into that constant state of renewal. So your sacred space is where you can find yourself again and again. And that is where we're putting ourselves in our processes. One of the last psychology concepts I'll leave you with is called social facilitation. And what this means is there's an improvement in your performance when you're partnered with or competing with others. What this means is as photographers, we share our experience. And this knowledge doesn't just make the other person better, it also makes us better. But at the end of the day, I want you to remember, we're only competing against ourselves and our own creative journey and that shadow of our former selves. And photography is one of the greatest pursuits we could ever have because we get visual proof of our work and we can actually see it in how our work progresses. So which takes us towards the end of our time tonight. We'll open up a Q&A and a little bit of where I am or who I am today. I don't want to create images that sacrifice the experience of the creative process or being in nature. I want to travel, but not if I'm running from place to place just to connect images or collect images. I want to spend time in nature not to build a portfolio or accumulate iconic images, rather to experience all that our amazing planet has to offer. I'd much rather share with you how I felt than what I saw. Rather talk about where I was personally than where I actually was physically. Today, I do think of myself as a creative, but the creative process is messy. My style is not defined by particular images, types of scene, or processing technique. What I've done over this journey and what I hope for you too is to widen our creative vocabularies and continue to do so for a long time to come. So what can I leave you with tonight? A major driver of psychological thought, innate human need. What I'd like to leave you with is freedom. And that's freedom from the constraints that are placed upon yourself of needing to follow the rules of those that came before you. Freedom from holding yourself to an artificial standard of how you need to judge your work, your own personal work, to the work of others. Freedom to create. You don't need to follow formulas. All that is in front of you has been there all the while. Let's learn to see the elements. And with that, I set you free, and we will go over to the Q&A. All right, so lost a few people, but still well over 100. So glad to have you with us. All right, so I'm going to pull up some questions. Okay, so first question, not actually it's a good question. So can you please add a credit card to pay? Many don't want to use PayPal. I know many, I'm one. Yes, so any of my workshops, if you look below where you register, it says pay with credit card. So you can actually click that and it will allow you to pay with credit card. And so that's one of the ones there. So, okay, and then another question about that, or comment about something. So, and then we got, okay. So let's see what kind of questions. So one question just came in, is the session being recorded? Is there an opportunity to revisit the recording later? Yeah, there is. It is being recorded and you'll get the recording sometime tomorrow. Revisit it to your heart's content. It's great, so. Other questions coming through. How did I get into psychology? Woo, deep one. Thank you, Susan. Susan asks, how did I get into psychology? Psychology was kind of a 1-2 punch or smack across the head or the face. I'm not sure you want to look at it with regards to when I was facing all of the burnout and some of the other emotional images, I got into therapy to really kind of help me make heads and tails of a lot of the different parts and pieces, A, from my childhood and B, from the professional part of what I was created. So when I finished my MBA, I realized, technically speaking, business-wise, there wasn't much more I needed to learn, but I wanted to learn more about what made me tick and where I kind of got a lot of my my drive, so to speak. So, so that was a big driver of it, and then a lot of it just became from understanding different psychology concepts. So, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl was a very influential book for me to understand that suffering was part of the process. And then as I got more and more into the photography stuff, really diving into the creative process. And I'll send a resource list out that has some of my favorite books related to creativity and kind of that creative process as well. So that's how I got into it. I continue to work at, I'm not a psychologist, you know, I make my living as a photographer, but understanding more and more of a lot of these brain principles has really helped me, A, to connect more with my audience when I'm teaching, both in the field and whatever else, and then B, to really connect more with myself, which is my creative work, which is great. Okay, lots of good questions. Do you always use black frames for your photographic prints? Yeah, you can ask whatever you guys want. So behind me, if you look at my prints, I love metal. Metal is actually really my preference. This one, I'm getting better at pointing behind me. This one right here is a Lumichrome. Dick noticed earlier some new prints on the wall. I appreciate he's always very, and Lumichrome is printed on a special type of like silver paper in between acrylic. And so that really, really reflects the light really, really well. And then my matted prints, I do use black. My matted stuff, I struggle to sell matted stuff except when my work's in galleries because people want larger prints in their homes. The metal is definitely my preference there, which is great. Which is a good question. Thanks for that question, Robert. Next question from David is, have I seen examples of where ego has impacted some photographers? I have seen a lot of examples of it. And in particular, when I was doing much more social photography with, so one of my friends, he has over 3 million followers on Instagram. He's a photographer. And I can tell you, he couldn't go out or do anything without constantly checking in with his Instagram, how many likes he was getting, what was happening, if it was getting retweeted or reposted, etc. And it was a major driver where at times he would start to speak of him, well, I shouldn't say, no, he didn't do that as much as another friend would play this game of reciprocity. I'm not going to like that person's photo because they didn't like the last photo that I put up. So it became this big ego-driven thing where they were starting to like and comment on images that they themselves probably didn't like, but they were just showing people that had liked or commented on them. And so that was a really interesting thing. So ego also became also a big driver, I think, of a lot of images we've seen out there of people taking risks, is because they want to continue to have that high, so to speak, of within the confines of photography, in terms of keeping that up in terms of the likes and everything else. And so it becomes an ego-driven thing. Myself personally, I've really recognized, become more friendly with my ego. It's still there, but I love the teaching aspect, because I'll have clients in classes that will produce images that are far better than anything I have on my walls. And I'll have clients that will produce images that it's the first one they've ever shown to anybody. So that element and level of humility, where we're all in a different part of this photographic journey, is a big part, which is great. So I appreciate the question, Dave. A good one. Susan asks, does my psychology include faith in God? My psychology includes spirit. I have a spiritual aspect to it, both through my meditation. I do daily meditation and spiritual prayer. And it constitutes different elements. And I talk about it in some of my other stuff, just so that belief in a power greater than myself, but not putting particular titles around particular aspects of it. But that strong belief in that power greater than myself has really helped me to bring out a lot of humility in my work, and also helped me to really keep my ego in check, but also be humble about my process. And so, like, here's my constant to-do list every single day, let's check in with that and have that humility to recognize, and the patience, I guess, as well. So, which is good. Good questions in here. So, is the desire to recreate color renditions a contradiction? George asks, and I don't think it is. And this is a question that comes up quite a bit in this whole process. And it's not I don't view it as a contradiction in terms of the color renditions. And maybe you're talking about within the realms of really creative processing. I'm not 100% sure, but I really like to most accurately reflect my photography. So there's three types of photography. There's abstract, there's representational, and then there's impressionistic. And representational is the majority of what you see behind me, and majority of my work. But then we get into things like the abstract stuff, which I really like, and we get into a lot of the impressionistic, which is night photography. Any type of night photography, Milky Way, star photography, that's not something you can see with the eye. And so then you have to gauge what it needs to be based on that particular thing. So that would be what I would say about that one as well. Okay, so then somebody else, the credit card, the $15 programs. Yeah, so when I send the information out, I'll send on that one. So, I'm going to jump over into the chat, see if there's some questions. Well, thank you, Fred. Well, thank you, Dick. Thank you, Darlene. Thank you so much. Great presentation. Nice to hear. So, do you pre-visualize a scene against all those? So the question comes from Mark. So with so much to remember, do you pre-visualize your scene against all those elements? It's a really good question, and the fundamental is how much planning goes into images versus recognizing what's out in the environment. And the answer is it varies. I love photo pills, the app Photo Pills, because it helps me so much to pre-visualize as much as possible and set myself up for the highest level of success. But I rarely pre-visualize a scene so much that I go there knowing exactly what I'm going to photograph. But I can at least go into a scene and have a sense of where the light's going to be. I'm going to have somewhat of a sense of what time the light's going to be coming or going, whether it's sunrise or sunset, or I'm going to have a good sense of where the Milky Way is going to be. And then it's going to be a lot about interpreting the scene as I go through and finding that out. So a lot of it is that, and that's why I say the most important physical element in photography, in my opinion, is light. Composition is a supporting element. Lines and shapes is really strong supporting element. Understanding light and how to work with that light is really what brings out the dramatic images. And so that's the bigger thing, is I'll go into a situation or a scene, and it's reading and understanding the light much more, which is great. Okay. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Clem. Nice things. Oh, good. Well, Sony, yes, I did give a similar presentation. I've put some pretty strong changes into this since I'm constantly tweaking this presentation, and I'll probably come out with some more. So by all means, feedback is encouraged. Good and bad. Like, hey, you could maybe talk more about that. I think I saw somebody in here say something about that they were there's a Mark. I'm an experimental psychologist. I find this presentation totally awesome, clinical term, which is great. I love that too. So yeah, so I'm still learning a lot of the principles of psychology and trying to find different ways to communicate the principles I know about photography versus just the traditional stuff you can read in the books. And so, which is great. So perfect presentation. Well, thank you, Lily. She says, I'll use it. How can I start photographing with animals? How can I get more into using the camera? I've lost interest using my camera. How can I become a professional photographer in the future? I'm actually going to do probably later this year a presentation, a class on ways to make money as a photographer. This isn't going to be going professional, because it's a son of a gun to be a professional photographer and make the amount of money you need to make to support your family. But there's a really great way to get started to make a little bit of money as a hobby, to understand what you like without losing a lot of money. I'm going to go through a bunch of different ways. Photography with animals, there's all kinds of, I would say, great YouTube tutorials. And I don't know, you can message me separately, Lily, about that. A lot of that has to do with specifics related to what type. When you're talking about photographing, is it more pet photography, or is it full-blown like safari wildland photography? And those two things are totally different things. The other recommendation I would have, depending on what level and where people are, there's two organizations I'm a member of. I did two, and then I showed you the number 3. One is the Photography Society of America, and the other is the Professional Photographers of America. The Professional Photographers of America, if you do have a lot of gear, that comes with a $15,000 inland marine insurance policy on your gear, which is huge. And then they have a lot of classes geared towards the startup photographer business-wise. The Photography Society of America, I've gotten involved with them through my photo club presentations, and they do a really great job of establishing community, et cetera. So those are two good resources as well. Tony, thank you. Teresa, thank you. I always try to give you a lot. Fred, thank you. Learned a lot. Thanks. All thought out. Your hard work paying off. Thanks. Nice things. Oh, Mark asks abused animals. Okay. Lily says abused animals. Yeah, so that's going to be something that's it's going to be a little bit different. I think, I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that in terms of, like, an abused animal, you probably want to avoid using a flash. So you'd have to be working in natural environment settings. I'd be curious if you did a little bit of searching on Facebook. There's a lot of photography groups on Facebook. So if I ever go back to social media, I'm hoping to be able to at least go back to Facebook, and then maybe have somebody run my Instagram. But because Facebook has so many great groups and communities. So I would go into some of the abuse things there and start asking questions. Sandy, thank you. I'm excited to be presenting in the Baltimore Camel Club at the end of April as well. So this is good. Mark asks, do I lead photo trips? In a non-COVID world, yes, I do. But right now I was sick of canceling things or getting canceled or having my plans turned upside down. So I just figured for 2021, I'll continue to do everything online and everything else. But yeah, in 2022, I'm hoping to do a Desert Southwest trip, which is one of my favorite areas to photograph. I'm on my way to Glacier and Yellowstone for August and September. So I'm hoping to scout out and be able to lead photography workshops up there. And then hoping to do a Central Coast fall photography class as well. So stay tuned. But yeah, some good stuff coming. I love infield photography classes. These are great. And we can have those conversations over the line, but in person, when we can physically show camera settings and talk about a scene, it makes a big difference. So David asked, what's my Instagram? My Instagram is completely deactivated, actually. It's been deactivated for over 2 years, almost 2.5 now. So my Instagram handle was Stover Photo, and you're not going to find anything there, so which is great. Do I plan to come to Massachusetts? I have family in Massachusetts and family in Maine. So I actually have, you can't quite see them, they're back over there. I have a couple Maine images on my wall as well. So I'd love to do something up in Acadia and possibly do some stuff, lighthouses and some of the other stuff. So be on the lookout. So, okay. All right, so we have a couple more over here. Nick asks, what are your favorite who are some of your favorite photographers? Probably my favorite photographer is Mark Adamus. He is an expedition photographer who does a lot of stuff out in the field, like really remote stuff. He really understands light really, really well. And he spends like 300 days in the year in the field. So he's, not even that's just crazy. I mean, if I could spend that much time in the field, I'd be an amazing photographer too. I really like him. He's a little light on the teaching in terms of teaching stuff. Sean Bagshaw is really strong. He has some really strong teaching stuff, and he's a great photographer. One of his colleagues is named Erin Bobnick, and she is an art history person who's got some great blog articles and other stuff, and she's a tremendous photographer. And then there's just a long list of others. Josh Cripps, he and I are going together to Canyonlands in March for 10 days, and looking forward to pulling some images back. He's got a massive YouTube following and a really talented photographer, great teacher as well. So there's plenty more. Yeah, so if you have a particular genre, for small scenes, Sarah Marino, she does really great intimate and small scene work, and she has some great stuff out there. My go-to lens, I think I responded back to you, Joe, and if you didn't get it, check your spam or email me again. I know I responded. It's a 28-300. And it's a Nikon 28-300. That's my go-to. And then the other one I like is a 14-24. How do I see the impact of the photographer's mood on the pictures? It's another great question. I look at some of my images in particular where I was in a very unconnected mind space. You could say I was either dealing with something on the personal side or just really, really scattered. And I wasn't at all, my images would come out very scattered and haphazard. I have some examples. I'd gone to the desert after some really unfortunate family news. And my first 3 or 4 days in the desert, my images were just haphazard. There was no order. There was no, I was not bringing any sort of compositional principles or anything in my images. They were, and it obviously is what I needed from there. And then as the trip went on, it got better and better. So the mood will definitely impact that. The processing, so it's a 1-2. One is your capture within the field, and then the second part is your processing as well. So you'll have those processing elements as well, where you'll be in a bad mood or not feeling great or didn't sleep well, and you're processing, you'll find it to be a lot darker. And I talk about technique, vision, and processing, and talk a little bit about mood. I need to go into more detail about mood because there's some ways to really shift that around. And it's just, all it is light and color. You can dramatically impact that. So. Comment on the presentation. Thank you. On the comments to leave the images with the word content on the screen loader. Okay, that's a good comment. And then where's the Central Coast? The Central Coast is in between San Francisco and San Luis Obispo. Sorry, I should have said that. I live in San Luis Obispo, so it's where you could listen between LA and San Francisco. Although I have a camper van and I'm out quite a bit as well, so which is great. All right, well, I said I'd go a little longer. We're at 6:45. I got a couple people that message saying they're going to drop for other presentations or dinner. So I'm probably going to wrap it up. And then you guys will get a copy of this tomorrow, along with any other questions you have. Feel free to reach out. And I appreciate everybody coming tonight. It's great attendance, great questions. I really enjoy these a lot. And we will go from there. So thanks so much, guys.